Welcome back to the Books Brothers Podcast, the book club turned podcast where friends spread across the country reconnect through the pages of a book. Each week we dive into what we are reading, sharing our thoughts and perspectives, all while enjoying a few laughs along the way. Whether you're a big reader or just enjoy listening to the discussion, join us as we explore interesting topics, narratives, and connect each week. I'm Adam.
I'm Garrett.
I'm Fliz.
I'm Matt.
I'm Thomas.
We are currently reading through Gates of Fire, an epic novel of the Battle of Thermopylae by Pressfield. This week we read and are discussing Book 3, Rooster. As this book opens, we return to the post-battle of Thermopylae interview with Xeones and the Persians. Here Xeones learns that after King Leonidas was killed, he was beheaded and subsequently crucified by the Persians. This clearly angers Xeones, but also Xerxes, as we learn that he too had great respect for Leonidas. Then the interview resumes, where Xeones returns to 6 years before the Battle of Thermopylae. This section introduces the character Dekton, known as Rooster. We learn that he is half Spartan and the illegitimate son of Dienekes' deceased brother-in-law, who was a great warrior of Sparta. Since he was only half Spartan, Rooster was viewed similarly as Xeones, lesser than the other Spartan boys and as a servant. Although he is offered to come into the Spartan community several times throughout the course of his life, secondary to his abilities as well as lineage, but Rooster hates the Spartans and their gods and is very open about that. He declines the offer every time. At the end of the section, Dienekes' wife, Arete, warns Xeones that if Rooster is not careful in the way that he speaks of Sparta, then the Spartan secret society may make him disappear. So I think that in this section, the contrast between Xeones and Rooster was quite interesting. Xeones, having no actual family ties to Sparta, shows extreme loyalty to the people in the land, even though he is essentially a slave. In contrast, Rooster, the son of a Spartan hero, chooses to be a slave instead of being accepted as a true Spartan, and in turn despises Sparta. What do you all think of this contrast?
I think it's similar to probably how we think of citizenship in any country, especially a country like ours where there's a lot of immigrants. And we talked, at the beginning of this podcast season about patriotism and whatnot, but you can meet people who have a ton of love and loyalty and respect and patriotism for a country, and they're not born there. They may not even be half-blood. They immigrated, and because of what the country's provided them or how they view the leader or the culture, they can be quite loyal. Whereas someone like Rooster, I'm thinking of like what modern day equivalents are. Okay, so the Messians, I believe, he's half Messian. His mom was full, and they're helots. So I had to look that up. They're like in between a slave and the working class. So they're like not like full on slaves, but they're not fully free, is how I understand it. So it's probably like the equivalent modern day of like someone who might be half black or half Native American or something, where they care about the background and lineage and history of half of their family line and really care about civil rights or care about the treatment of their people hundreds of years in the past and how that rolls up into the present. So I can understand why someone might immigrate here and love the United States. This example, Xeones coming to Lake Daemon as with the Spartans, and then Rooster, being half Spartan, but not enjoying the fact that half of his, the people who represent half of his bloodline or half of his lineage or whatever are helots or slave or the helot class in Sparta, and thus, dislikes where he lives. So that's probably like how I view this equivalent in kind of modern day scenarios.
I viewed it as kind of a privilege thing where Xeones, he chose to go to Sparta because he had nowhere else to go. He didn't have any family. His hometown is burned. He wanted to become a warrior, and so he knew of Sparta and chose to go there himself. Whereas Rooster, like Garrett was saying, he was born there and he had the privilege of growing up in that society already. But Rooster didn't have full rights as a citizen, and so he was treated poorly. It wasn't his choice to go to Sparta. It wasn't his choice to participate, to become a slave. He was born into it. So it's almost like a privilege thing. I think for Xeones, based on what he wanted to do and the choices that he had, Sparta was the best place to end up. And so he's going to give it everything he has. And all these people have become his family, essentially.
When you say that, Matt, what's your thought, or how do you see, like, what's the reason that you see Xeones coming to Sparta? What do you think he chose that? I feel like I kind of understand that, but I was curious to hear how you interpret it.
Yeah, from the earlier chapters in the book, he and his cousin Dienekes were on their own in the wild. And then Xeones had that vision of Apollo, who is the archer god. And that gave him the faith and motivation to want to learn how to use a bow. And growing up in the wild, learning how to use a bow, becoming really good at doing it, I think that spurred him to want to continue on that path. And then when his cousin Dienekes left, he didn't want to stay in Athens because it's not a warrior society. Xeones wanted to become a warrior. So it sounds like he knew of Spartan culture and the way that they treated slaves. So if he could get there, he would maybe have a chance to become a warrior and use the bow. Nowhere else to go for his motivations.
I think, too, it seemed like he was always kind of like motivated by a very certain type of manhood. It seemed like, and essentially like power. You know, go back to whenever his town was burned, and he was like so mad at his uncle for like not for running away while his family was getting killed. And it seems like he has this sense of like how a man should be, and that to me, like, what seemed to play a role as well of his movement there.
Yeah, I did like that. At the beginning of this chapter, we see a little bit of punishment from when Alexandros and Xeones went to go see that battle from the previous book. And now Xeones is basically working for Rooster, taking care of the herds. And Rooster hates Xeones. Even though they're both slaves, Rooster is mad at Xeones because he doesn't feel the same way that he does about the Spartans.
I don't know. I just think Rooster's a misfit. He doesn't really appreciate any kind of real like honorable values, stuff like that. I just see him as like this just character, like kind of just wants to do his own thing. Xeones more values honor and all the Spartan, ideals and stuff. So
when you're reading a book that's a narrative like this, it's always easy to put yourself in the one telling the story, Xeones. But you do have to look at what Rooster had been through, and as Garrett was kind of alluding to, with basically his like half lineage, that you could see how that could definitely foster some resentment. And there's definitely examples that we think of often in America where people are, they're not choosing to leave, but they're obviously really unhappy about the way that things are. And every election cycle this comes around, every election, it's like, oh, if so and so wins, I move into Canada. And I think back to what Matt's saying, it's like it feels like when people say that kind of stuff, it's like coming from a place of privilege, because not everyone where they live, they get to like choose to leave,
Right.
And that's kind of a deeper thought with that. So in book 3, we again see Alexandros in conflict with the same Spartan, Polynikes, as before. Polynikes is essentially an up-and-coming Spartan hero. He is awarded prizes of valor and is known for his strength and speed. He questions Alexandros on what he thought of viewing war in person for the first time. Alexandros notes that the battle made him sick, and as a result has not been able to sleep since. This response enrages Polynikes, and he thus seeks to make an example of him. Polynikes views war as a necessity to remain free and stay alive. He describes in detail the joy he gets from killing the enemy and knowing that it means his freedom. Polynikes is angry because he knows that he needs to rely upon his fellow Spartans in battle, and he views Alexandros as unworthy of standing next to him in battle. He ends his chastisement of Alexandros with the quote, "War, not peace, produces virtue. War, not peace, purges vice. War in preparation for war. Call forth all that is noble and honorable in a man. It unites him with his brothers and binds them in selfless love, eradicating in the crucible of necessity all which is base and ignoble." So what was your guys' thoughts on this exchange?
I think that quote you had just read, Stehlin, is just a really brief part of the whole exchange, and it brings out the best of it and the reason why, which is really cool. My first thought is going back to thinking about World War II and how wartime brought the country together and brought jobs, people fighting for the country, fighting as one unit to win the war. But you might be getting into this later. Polynikes is basically berating Alexandros for not loving war like he does. And it's like mental punishment. And he's pretty vicious.
Mm-hmm.
He goes really, really far. So there's a purpose behind it, this mental beration. It's supposed to harden your mind and get you used to dealing with things mentally to prepare you for war. You have to be able to take the bad things, what people say about you, and turn it into something good. And Alexandros is just kind of sitting there agreeing with Polynikes, not really saying anything. But as we learned from this chapter, the expectation is that you are supposed to have humor about it. And Alexandros is not showing that. They're supposed to just be making jokes and going along with the mental punishment, I guess. But Alexandros is just sitting there, taking it and not doing anything. So I think that makes Polynikes even more upset. And so he goes further and further. And then eventually Dienekes is like, okay, you've gone too far with this mental beration. I think it was in this part where they mentioned that making this a habit is what makes you strong. Is that right?
Yeah, he says that later on. Yeah, so what he
Okay.
says is, habit will be your champion.
Yeah, that was really cool. With this type of barrage, I don't think that would fly today. I think if someone were to act like that towards anyone in America, they would just be canceled. Especially if it's in front of a group. What do you guys think about that?
I thought about this in terms more about, like, I guess the theology of war, or like nonviolence movement. Not a movement, but just I've just listened to some Christian theologians and professors that believe that, again, the Spartans aren't Christians, but it's from a Christian perspective, there should be a, nonviolence and things like that. So I read, on that same page, Polynikes is mankind is weak, greedy, lustful, prey to every species of vice and depravity. But fortunately, God in his mercy has provided a counterpoise to our species' innate depravity. That gift, my young friend, is war. So just a very fascinating response to, like, all right, all these issues in mankind, the fix here is just to, like, kill people about it. And I'm agreeing with you, Matt, of, like, in today's day and age, it's doesn't really, like, feel that way in terms of that. That just seems like someone who would be beyond canceled, at least in our society, present day. And I just think about how the wars are so constantly monitored in the press, and it's like, these bombs went off here and these many civilians were injured, this many women and children were killed, and obviously it's all horrific, but it's observed to the T. And then I read this book, and going back to the first Diamanchi or whatever, she's like raped by all those soldiers who ransack her town. And then one of the guys, I say this in quotes, is kind enough to tell Xeones, he's like, hey, don't take her to another town. This is going to happen to her again. It's like, that's just like how it is. And I don't know. It's just like, it was like, life has not changed. Like, people are still like that, the depravity, but I think there are more systems in place overall, I'd like to believe, in most countries to avoid that level of depravity and that level of inability to have any sort of order. I don't know if I'm making sense, other than, like, because there's more order, more structure, more systems in place to protect people, I think war, hopefully is not needed as often, but maybe I'm wrong.
I'm sure that back in the day, many more people took the perspective that war is like an inevitable part of life and something that you can take pride in, just because they weren't as privileged as a modern Western human being, to where they don't actually have to see it with their own eyes. And I can't really tell if, like, our belief in, peace being the only way, or peace and love being like the ultimate solution is like an evolved form of thinking, or if it's actually naive to what human nature actually results in 99% of the time.
We've all heard like the thought too that it's like this has been a relative time of peace as far as the world has experienced that's, that we're in right now. Obviously, there's always countries warring against countries, obviously with Russia and Ukraine and such right now. But in general, we're pretty insulated from this kind of true depravity of constant warfare that would have been taking place much more at this time period. I know this last year, I've spent a lot of time reading about books about the American West and how the American West essentially became the American West. And I mean, it was just truly depravity like this. I mean, there's just battle after battle that's constantly going on. A lot of really horrible things occurring on a pretty regular basis to people out in frontier areas. And, obviously all the ways in which Native Americans were mistreated through that, but also just like the viciousness of man as people tried to acquire more land or protect their land. But yeah, so I think like I personally, like Matt, I see what you're saying, and we definitely get the picture that Polynikes is coming from not a place in kind, and that this is he very much mistreats Alexandros in this situation. But I do think that considering the times, like that final quote, I think it's a pretty powerful quote when you think about it, and about essentially war, not peace. But it's also a time and a place kind of thing. If you consider the situation, that was the way I would imagine, kind of had to think. So kind of to continue on this just a little bit further, you guys feel like you see any application to this in our modern lives?
What do you mean application?
So I'll reread the quote. So, war not peace produces virtue. War not peace purges vice. War in preparation for war call forth that all that is noble and honorable in man. It unites him with his brothers and binds them with selfless love, eradicating the crucible of necessity, all which is base and ignoble. So any application as you all read that, as you think about that?
Yeah, I think it comes down to discipline and preparing for what's to come. So this chapter with Polynikes is showing us how the Spartans view mental discipline and being able to be in the right mindset when hard times come or when someone is talking bad about you. And I think a lot of that is lost in today's culture. If you say something bad about someone right now, then chances are you're going to be recorded and then you're going to get canceled, or people are going to say you're a terrible person for saying those things. But Flez keeps on saying Gen Z is weak and pansies. Compared to the Spartans, yeah, they are mentally training their young men to be disciplined and to be able to do what they're supposed to do when the hard times come. And I think that is kind of lost in a lot of today's men.
Yeah. I think of, we talked about a couple weeks ago, some of we'll call it the Goggins philosophy, right? So David Goggins talks about the hardening of the mind. And I think that some might view that phrase as just a negative thing. But to me, I see the application of discipline, of like how disciplined can you be not falling into kind of a victim mindset, and also doing everything you can to prepare for what life may throw at you.
My cousin's husband's in town from Germany, and he was in the Air Force, and we're talking about this tonight, but he was saying that like young kids today cannot take any kind of criticism anymore. And they use some examples of people crying whenever they're critiqued, like in a workplace type scenario. And he was talking about how the military prepares you to take criticism daily so that whenever you're out into civilian life, you're not one of these people that gets yelled at by their boss for something and then goes and cries. But I think that maybe I'm just ragging on Gen Z again. But I think like the hardening of the mind is just like another example of being able to take criticism. Criticism isn't bad. My cousin's husband was like, they would do, whenever he was doing pilot training, he's like, I don't want to know what I'm good at. Don't tell me what I'm good at. Tell me what I'm bad at. Like, that's what I want to know. What am I bad at? But people now, like, they don't want to be told what they're bad at. they want to be praised and can't take any criticism. So
I still remember I had this exchange with this student I was working with, and I feel like I'm pretty mindful when I'm giving feedback and doing so in a caring, compassionate way. And I remember I had told this student, some of the patients are saying that you're coming across a little bit harsh and maybe not very friendly. And I kind of gave some input as to like, hey, here's some ways in which you can soften up a little bit. And the response that I got back was, well, that's just the way that I am. And I think the idea is like, I give a critique, right? And then it's not only is the critique not accepted and like, okay, I'll work on that, but it's like, how dare you critique me? Because that's me. Like, that's who I am. Like, I can't change myself. And I think that's sad. And Adam, you mentioned Gen Z, but it really, I mean, a lot of people are this way. A lot of people, they kind of accept their weaknesses and they say like, yeah, that's just like how it is.
I think as it pertains to how, we raise our kids in modern day America versus how the Spartans raised their young men, they were doing what they thought was the loving thing to do, given the backdrop and the context of the period and what they expected their kids to have to deal with. And I think you can't really blame them any more than you blame parents today for trying to position their kids in the world in a certain way. I will say that parents back in the day they definitely had a lot less concern with their children's well-being mentally and physically, which I think probably did build that kind of anti-fragile mindset like we learned about in the anxious generation compared to today. But I feel like it's really hard to compare the two because it's apples and oranges, like if the United States has been in a state of constantly being attacked on their own soil for the last 50 years, our culture would be totally different. Our kids would be raised totally differently. I also draw parallels when we talk about this to the way that generational wealth seems to, I know this sounds like a big jump, but like generational wealth seems to not be able to stick around more than 2 or 3 generations because the generation who built the skills needed to gain a certain amount of wealth spoils the next generation, and then the 3rd or 4th generation has never even seen what ingenuity or real work looks like or discipline looks like in order to keep that whole train going into the future. So I think it's kind of the same thing with the discipline of war and everything else. If you're in peacetime for X amount of years, there's really no need to try to harden your young generation because you don't even know what war looks like anymore.
Yeah. So in this section, I also wanted to spend a little more time talking about Dienekes, so previously noted as Alexandros' mentor. In this section, Dienekes yet again shows a nurturing form of leadership. So as Matt kind of mentioned, Dienekes essentially rebukes Polynikes for embarrassing Alexandros, but yet he even does so in kind, stating that he hopes that Polynikes survives as many battles in the flesh as he has already fought in his imagination, and that he also may acquire humility. In private, Dienekes later encourages Alexandros. He explains that Polynikes was not seeking to harm, but rather to teach. He also impresses upon him the importance of discipline and stating, habit will be your champion. When you train the mind to think one way, and one way only, when you refuse to allow it to think in another, that will produce great strength in battle. And this is what Matt was referencing earlier. To end this section, Dienekes decides to reassign the squires. Xeones is no longer Alexandros' helper, but rather will be Dienekes. And Rooster will now be assigned to Alexandros' father, Olympias. So Dienekes appears to have more depth to him than most characters. At least that's kind of what I'm picking up on. Do you all feel that he embodies a true Spartan leader, or is he rather an exception to a Spartan leader? And to clarify, he seems to kind of have the softer touch. He's a little more nurturing than some of these other leaders that we're seeing. Do you feel like in him, is that him being truly Spartan, what they're aspiring to be as a culture, or rather is he an exception to that?
I think for me, I don't know. I probably don't have an answer to your question if he's an exception, but I think what I've enjoyed about this book is the character development of various Spartans, where my only other background on this group is like the movie 300. And it's like everybody's got a 6-pack. Everyone's just screaming all the time. And everyone's just like sweaty and chanting, And there's no fear of death ever. They all love it. And it just is what it is kind of thing. So to me, I'm like, I think this is just humanity. I mean, think of the fraternity. Think of us. We all have vastly different. We all grew up in Missouri, in one specific part of the country. Yeah, we have pretty different views.
Except for Roberto.
Yeah. Well, no, even him, Nebraska, right? Like in that same.
That's not Missouri, though.
Well, I just mean like the Midwest, all within a few 100-mile radius of each other, like culturally very similar.
Yeah.
And just that, like, we all have very different personalities and nurturing, toughness, very emotive, very stoic, whatever it may be. And I think that's what's great about the Spartans is like Alexandros likes art and poetry. And it's like modern day, right? Like I'm on the football field at practice in high school and it's like, oh, the soccer players and slurs were being said. You can imagine you can just fill in the blank. And it's like, that's not like what manhood is about. Other people didn't care. Some people tried to be super tough, like Polynikes, and others didn't, you know what I mean? And so Alexandros, as the book goes on, turns out he is initiated. He is a warrior. He fights. So it's not like you have to be one way. You don't have to be like, not Leonidas, the actual person, but Gerard Butler's, his interpretation of Leonidas in the movie, and just scream the whole time and just like never have any fear. That's what's been really cool about this. So I don't think there's like one way. I think the ultimate thing is like, will you hold up your shield and protect the person to your left and to your right? And there's a whole host of nurturing personalities, not, screamo, verbally abusive Spartans. I don't think there's necessarily one way, but the bottom line is that you have to be willing to fight and not be afraid to the point where you will defend your brother no matter what.
To me, I think Dienekes is the ideal male Spartan.
Mm-hmm.
So he's portrayed as, and we'll see more of this in the next book, but as the most honorable type of person there is. Incredible warrior, obviously. All these people are like Olympic level athletes. And he's a little bit older too. So I think he has the experience of fighting in wars, but he's also wiser compared to, say, Polynikes, who's mid-20s or so. And I think just being older, being a father, brings wisdom, from experience. And so being an honorable man, being an incredibly gifted warrior, being wise, that it makes you an ideal type of person. At least that's how the book is portraying him to be so far.
Yeah, I agree with that, Matt. I think that in the way that I'm reading, because it's kind of from Xeones' perspective, you almost get this sense that Xeones is surprised by the compassion that Dienekes shows. And I think that you're right, though, in the sense that he does have this complexity to him that is truly Spartan, or essentially ideal man, right? And I think that if you look at the different stages of these other individuals, Xeones being like 14, 15 at this point, and Polynikes being in his like mid-20s, I can relate to it because like what I viewed as being truly manly attributes at 14, 15, and even at 25, I think is drastically incorrect as to what I view manhood now. And so I think Dienekes really exemplifies masculinity in that. And so yeah, that's kind of how I'm coming to it, of this point of like, wow, he's strong, but yet he can deal with the complexities of things. That's, for me, that's what I strive for that. That's my kind of hope, is to like try to find that balance of, I think that's what manhood is about, is being a complex individual who can have the strength to care for your family and then yet deal with more emotional, sensitive issues. Earlier I mentioned the quote that Dienekes says. So he says, habit will be your champion. What does this mean to you guys?
Yeah, I mean, we are our habits.
So, Adam, can you remind me of the poster that you had up in your room when you were growing up?
You remember it, which is funny.
Oh, dude, it's so
I don't
good.
even remember it. The Perseverance one?
Yeah, what does it say? So growing up, Adam had this in his room, and I don't know why, but it is like always stuck with me. Apparently it's Gandhi who said it. I don't know if he first said it, but it's your beliefs become your thoughts become your words become your actions become your habits become your values, and your values become your destiny.
I don't remember that being Gandhi.
I don't think it said that on your poster. I remember it was like a basketball hoop on it on your poster.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember. That was a good one, though. We'll go with that. With that being it.
That's what it is.
Habit
will be your champion. That's what it means.
That's a much shorter way to say it. Yeah, I think of the book Atomic Habits, which is still extremely popular 5-6 years after it was published. And I just read it for the first time earlier this year. And I feel like I've seen some of the fruit of that, and making some dietary changes, some exercise changes, and very small tweaks that compound. And I think the author in Atomic Habits uses the phrase, like, if you just get like 1% better today throughout that 1% over the course of 100 days or a couple of years or whatever, really grows. So
marginal gains.
Yeah. And with this story and Alexandros, and it's like, hey, like, this is who you are. You are a Spartan, and this is what's expected of you. So we have to create the habits that no matter what, you're going to be, prepared for battle. And I think there's truth to that in every aspect of life, not just war, but specifically when it comes to war. I mean, because back then too, it's literally face to face with your enemy. It's not like shooting off rockets and being thousands of miles away fighting the enemy. You have to, it's those weapons and those arrows and those swords and spears are literally going to be right there, and you can't flinch. You can't have a moment of fear, and you have to stick to the plan, your commands, your orders. And that is built through all this training that they do and the hardening of the mind. And you build those habits. And that's why at the beginning, only 23 died when they killed thousands or whatever it was.
I got some good notes from the Atomic Habits book. So the first one is, success is the sum of our daily habits. It's not some miraculous event. It's a good one. Systems are greater than goals. Goals help set a direction, but systems help for making progress. Winners and losers all have the same goals. Achieving a goal is a momentary win. Goals restrict your happiness. You can't be happy until you hit your goal. Goals create an either-or conflict, which is a narrow box of happiness. Fall in love with the process rather than the product. You can be happy anytime the system is running. Yeah, that's a good book. I really highly recommend it. And then it's like each habit is an atom that builds to the bigger success of your life. Yeah, it's a good book.
I just really like this quote towards the end when Xeones does become a squire to Dienekes. He basically gets promoted from taking care of the cattle and the herds to being Dienekes' second squire. But the way Dienekes says it to Xeones, I thought was really funny. And maybe you guys can relate, but to be a squire, you have to be as dumb as a mule, numb as a post, and obedient as an imbecile. He says, in these, Xeones, you are impeccable.
I remember that, yeah.
Can you guys relate to that at all? Would you guys make a good squire?
Only if you were who I was with.
You do all the cattle stuff for him too. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Books Brothers podcast. Join us next time as Garrett leads the discussion on Book 4, Arete, from the book Gates of Fire by Steven Pressfield. If you haven't yet, there's still time to get the book so you can follow along with us. If you have enjoyed listening or benefited from our conversation, please subscribe, give us a review, and share with a friend that you want to connect with. Lastly, we would love to hear your thoughts. You can reach us by email at connect@booksbrotherspodcast.com or on Instagram at booksbrotherspodcast. Until next week, read, reflect, and connect.